a crucial turning point in Lebanon's history was, like you mentioned, the influx of Palestinian guerrilla groups
Yeah.
who moved from Jordan after Black September.
Black September.
So, why did they choose Lebanon to be their new base?
It's interesting. Like, okay, they were thrown out of Jordan.
Yeah.
Because Black September, there was this sustained military operation by the Jordanese forces. Hussein was the king,
Yeah.
Abdullah's father. Abdullah II is the current monarch. And because Hussein turned against the Palestinians because the Palestinians had become a state within the state in Jordan. And Jordan also, vast majority of the Jordanese citizens were of Palestinian origin.
Right.
And the Hashemite monarchy came from the Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah.
So that contradiction has always been there. When the Palestinians regrouped and they built institutions, parallel institutions and militant organizations in Jordan that posed a threat to, or at least the king thought that that posed a threat to his grip on the Jordanian society, and then he turned against the Palestinian guerrillas, mainly the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. So, I mean, in an interesting interview, King Hussein later said he was asked what was the toughest decision of your reign, and then he said the decision to bomb my own city.
Right.
Basically, the bombing of Amman. Basically, he bombed the Palestinian refugee camps in the city. Okay, the Palestinians were expelled. The question is, where will they go next?
Yeah.
And your question is, why Lebanon?
Yes.
You could find multiple factors. One is, as I told you earlier, Lebanon is a country without a cohesive state. The union structure is very weak, right? So that means you have a space in society to maneuver for militant organizations such as the PLO. The PLO, and there were, I mean, PLO was only an umbrella organization. There were multiple left-wing Palestinian liberation movements that had signed up to the PLO. All of them were moving to southern Lebanon. So one is that Lebanon did not have a unitary, a powerful state structure.
Right.
So that is one factor. And second factor is that within Lebanon, I mean, there was this overwhelming sympathy towards the Palestinian cause, which was the case with many Arab countries at that point of time. Because yes, King Hussein had turned against them, but that doesn't mean that other Arab countries had completely given up on the Palestinians. No. So in Lebanon, the Lebanese army and the Lebanese state, even other Sunni groups in Lebanon, they maintained the sympathy to the Palestinians and they welcomed the PLO.
Right.
So that's another factor. And the third factor is that PLO built their bases in southern Lebanon. Across the border, you have Israel. So which means from southern Lebanon, you can fight the Israelis.
Right.
And back in the early 1970s, the PLO's position was that they wanted to liberate the whole of Palestine from the river to the sea.
Yeah.
So river to the sea means, okay, on the one side you have the Mediterranean Sea, and on the other side you have the Jordan River, and in the north you have the Lebanese border.
Right.
So that's the border of the historical Palestinian state.
Yes.
So for the PLO, yes, this is a friendly environment, and this is also a country with a weak government that give you space, and that also means that you have some allies in Lebanon. Third, you are closer to the Israeli border, from where you can continue to fight your guerrilla warfare against the occupiers.
Right.
So all these factors, I think, came together. And then in Cairo Pact with the Arab countries, the PLO signed the Cairo Pact in 1979, as part of which they decided to move. Eventually, they gradually moved to Lebanon. And another factor you have to keep in mind is that Lebanon also had sizable number of Palestinian refugees.
Right.
So that gives PLO the space, basically, the space to operate, right? Palestinian refugees and refugee camps, they can recruit guerrillas from the refugee camps, and they can also create their own institutions among the Palestinians living in Lebanon.
Right.
So all these factors came together, and then the PLO moved to Lebanon, and they established their own state network. They were a state within the state in Jordan, and now they are a state within the state in Lebanon.
Right.
And this also altered, basically some of the social conditions in Lebanon.
Yes.
For example, the Sunni Muslims and left-wing Sunni groups, Muslim groups at that time, they welcomed the PLO because they empathized with the Palestinian cause and they were committed to the liberation of Palestine. Whereas Maronite Christians saw the PLO, the arrival of the PLO, as a problem.
Right.
Because they thought that the social balance would be altered. Because the PLO I mean, they are overwhelmingly Arab Muslims,
Right.
Arab Sunni Muslims. So the Maronite Christians thought that, I mean, they were the dominant group and they controlled the presidency. So they thought that the arrival of the Palestinian guerrillas as well as refugees would alter the social balance. So they were not open to this idea.
Right.
So this created social tensions. I mean,
Right.
the tensions that were buried under the facade of the national pact.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
these tensions started coming into the surface with the arrival of the Palestinian guerrillas, right? And then Israelis saw an opportunity.
Right.
They saw an opportunity because they, I mean, for them, who's their enemy? The PLO is their enemy,
Yes.
or the PLO's allies are their enemy. Who doesn't like the PLO? Maronite Christians don't like the PLO.
Yeah.
So your enemy's enemy is your friend.
Yeah.
So the Israelis thought that they can go into Lebanon, ally with the Maronite Christians,
Right.
and change the political course of Lebanon.
Right.
So this was actually the beginning of the Israeli interventions in Lebanon.
Right. So to what extent did this move pull Lebanon into the sort of the center of the Arab-Israeli conflict?
It did because you see in the early 1970s the PLO was moving, right? Israel's first invasion of Lebanon was in 1978, what they call Operation Litani.
Yes.
And it's interesting that you look at every Israeli invasion of Lebanon. 1978, 1982, 2006, 2025, 2026, Litani always comes up.
Yeah.
So just a couple of weeks ago, they were bombing, they were basically blowing up bridges across the Litani River because Litani is in the southern Lebanon. That is the connecting point between southern Lebanon, between the south and the rest of the country. You blow up the bridges, which means Israel doesn't want Hezbollah to connect with their allies in the north.
Right.
Or, I mean, what Israel wants to turn the entire southern Lebanon into a buffer zone. Now, what they call a buffer zone. It's an invasion and occupation in plain language. So in 1978, what the Israelis wanted to do was to turn. I mean, at that time, there was no Hezbollah.
Right.
78.
Yes.
It's PLO.
Yes.
Now it's Hezbollah.
Yeah.
So the operation remains the same. Strategy remains the same. Objective remains the same. Only the actor changes.
Right.
So back in 1978, Israel wanted to expel the PLO towards the north of the Litani River. And then they wanted to create what they call a buffer zone in the south. Buffer zone means you carve out more Lebanese territory.
Right.
And then you keep your men there. At that time, there was this force called South Lebanese Army, SLA. So South Lebanese Army was an Israeli proxy.
Yeah.
So they created them. They were funding them, providing them military assistance. And the South Lebanese Army, they were doing Israel's bidding in Lebanon.
Right.
So Israel wanted this buffer zone to be maintained by the SLA. And pushing the PLO out of southern Lebanon. So they sent troops. But that war, I mean, they couldn't meet any of their objectives and they had to finally pull back under international pressure.
Right.
But the South Lebanese Army maintained, let's say, a slice of territory in the south, which the Israelis continued to call the buffer zone.
Right.
But the PLO remained a major force. The plan was to push the PLO out of the south. No, that didn't happen.
Right.
But the Israelis had to pull back. But the Israelis never, they don't give up on their objectives.
Yeah.
Right? They pulled back in 1978. But in 1982, they would go back in.
Yeah, much further.
Much further.
Yeah.
This time they would launch an all-out invasion.
Right.
They would start bombing Beirut. Because this time, what the Israeli, I mean, see, I told you about a rising alliance between the Maronites and the Israelis, right? So this time Israel actually saw an opportunity because there is this politician called Bashir Gemayel. He's a Maronite Christian, a young politician, charismatic one, who was seen as a hero by the Christians, but at the same time a very ruthless guy, who was also seen as a threat by other communities in Lebanon. He was also accused of committing war crimes by some, but for Maronites, he is still a hero.
Right.
The Israelis would join hands with him. And the Israeli plan this time was to push the PLO out of Lebanon altogether.
Right.
1978, it was to push them towards the north, but this time Israel wanted to get rid of them.
Right.
So they would enforce a siege to the city of Beirut.
Right.
And they would also launch a complete invasion of southern Lebanon. And inside Lebanon, they would join hands with the Maronite Christians. Basically, Bashir Gemayel's party, Kitaib party.
Right.
He was also running his own militia group.
How did this alter the political landscape of Lebanon?
What the Israelis thought was, you force the PLO to leave the country and you get Bashir Gemayel as the president.
Right.
Which means you have a regime change. you got rid of your enemy
Mm-hmm.
and you can continue to dominate Lebanon.
Right.
So this was the Israeli plan. Okay.
Right.
And the siege of Beirut would eventually force the PLO to leave the country. So that was a major advantage for the Israelis.
Right.
The PLO, Yasser Arafat left the country and they would move from Beirut to Tunisia, Tunis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's say from 1980 till the Oslo Agreement, 1994, the PLO was based in Tunisia.
Right.
Okay, because they were not allowed to operate inside the West Bank
Yeah,
by the
yeah.
Israelis. So they were always operating in neighboring countries. So they would move to North Africa,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that was a major, let's say, achievement for the Israelis, that they
Right.
got rid of the PLO. And Bashir Gemayel got elected as the president of Lebanon.
Right.
So that was also, then the Israelis thought, wow, it's happening.
Right.
We are going to kind of be in the driving seat.
Yeah.
But there was one more actor in the scene,
Mm-hmm.
and that was Syria.
Yes.
Okay.